Hello, welcome. Sorry for me starting late. Been in here in front of the computer and lost track of time. So we are on Reconstruction, all right? And with Reconstruction, there's a basic narrative that is commonly found in the books of Eric Foner, Foner. He's just well known in this field, all right? And so the common narrative is that there arose a great demand in the North, especially amongst radical Republicans, but you didn't have to be a radical Republican or anything that even approximated an abolitionist to succumb to the mood that was a little bit punitive and vindictive of putting the South in its place. All right. So the narrative, there's data to fit that narrative that I'll go over pretty soon. And but that wasn't the it didn't have staying power. The changes down in the South did not have staying power. And Foner suggests, as do other historians, that perhaps partly that emanated from Northern motives not being pure, as far as really altruistically wanting what was best for African Americans in the South. All right. So the data goes 600,000 men die in the Civil War, right? Um, and at the end of the war, there were no war tribunals. With the exception, of course, of the assassination of the president, Mary Surratt, Powell, Polinsky, or not Polinsky, is another Polish name. But at any rate, a handful of people that were a part of that assassination plot to kill the president, to kill William Seward, the abolitionist Secretary of State, and to kill the Vice President, Andrew Johnson. But the Fort Pillow massacre and other cases of such, nothing was ever done. The property confiscation ended up going back into the hands of the old Confederate leaders. And the war was done, and Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, comes right back into Congress with his feet up on the desk and pretty much says, "We're back, boys," with a laugh. And it just seemed too easy. It seemed unfair. And you get the common adjective for the South that they were unrepentant because there was a large segment of the Northern population that believed that the war was triggered by the South, that the South had begun the war. They engaged in brinkmanship before the war as early as 1820 over Missouri, threatened to secede if they didn't get their way. They eventually did secede, right? And Lincoln said basically in his first inaugural speech, "Don't be silly, guys. I promise I won't touch slavery in the states where it already is um, sanctioned by state government. Please come back. I can't just let you leave without a fight." And he had them fire first at Fort Sumter. And so there was a large segment of the northern population that felt that the South had initiated this this bloodlust and this war of attrition. And yet nothing was changed, as if the boys had fought and died for nothing. So the euphemism for that day was waving the bloody shirt. So people would wave the bloody shirt and say, "Evidently, guys, we fought in vain. Nothing has changed in the South. They're unrepentant, and we lost our boys for nothing." Um, you had the Committee on Reconstruction in the Senate, and they sent men to investigate the South, and they came up with a lot of disconcerting data. There was tons of violence against African Americans. People were lashing out at them after the 13th Amendment. Um, they were getting around, they were circumventing the 13th Amendment by virtue of these trespassing laws, loitering laws, apprenticeship laws, all these ways of forcing the African Americans to go back to the plantations and work for the planters, basically, as well as their children. And they tried to get their wives to do so as well. And there was a great fight over that. And so some of the members of that committee actually were attacked. Um, so that was not good. Um, it brought quite an image, right, of this unrepentant, violent South. So then, remember, Charles Sumner's in charge, and he had been nearly beaten to death by Preston Brooks. And so there might have been a little bit of vindictiveness going on at this point, and just being fed up in the North. And so they had 1866 congressional elections, and they put in a large number of radical Republicans. All right. And, you get two different images of the radical Republicans, and I don't see how you can't reconcile the two. I see them both reconciled in Thaddeus Stevens as an example of both. But one is that they are these abolitionist do-gooders who were very progressive for their time and genuinely wanted what was best for African Americans. Remember, some of them went the full gamut. Uh, there was, you had racist free soilers that were okay with abolition of slavery. That was nothing at this point. That was a moot point that slavery was done. But then what do you do with them afterward, right? Um, the Dutch, the Romans, and others that had levels of citizenship. And so the Americans kind of, in their discourse, they came from that avenue. Said, well, maybe we'll just give them basic economic rights to be paid for their jobs and wages, to be able to rent and purchase property. And that's good enough, right? Then the next level, arguably, was political protection under the law, with criminal law and so forth, that they could take people to court and defend their constitutional rights, etc. And then a third level was finally participation or suffrage, whereby they're allowed to vote, participate in government, be elected as politicians, etc. And then the final arguable level was social integration. Be willing to have your family members intermarry with the black family, live side by side with them, and integrate with them fully. So some of the radical Republicans went the full gamut. They were definitely ahead of their time. But the other image, portrayed by William H. Dunning, known as the Dunning thesis, was that they were vindictive. They just wanted to punish and divide the South. And so that which they did for African Americans, they did in a rather vindictive spirit rather than humanitarian. So, but like I said, I don't see how they're mutually exclusive. Um, so when they were elected in 1866, now they could override with two-thirds majority, the Republicans, the new president. Remember, the new president, he made it clear he was indifferent about slavery. He was simply just patriotic from Tennessee. He had a very anti-planter prejudice because he was arguably one of the presidents who was brought up in the most utmost poverty. Okay. And so he had been called a cracker more than once in his life, poor white trash. And he had that kind of proverbial chip on his shoulder about it. So he couldn't wait to put the planters in their place, but that was it. He surely didn't want to empower their slaves. All right. Frederick Douglass has a famous quote whereby Lincoln embraced him and during the war, and he got a very cold and hateful gaze that he could feel from the vice president. And he said that man is no friend of the Negro. Um, you also have a direct quote from Andrew Johnson, this vice president from Tennessee, contending that that Reconstruction is for the white man. The South should be run by the white race, period. So he was pretty straightforward about his prejudice and his indifference to the plight of African Americans. So now you find him to be the president, right? Because Lincoln was trying with the Copperheads up in the North, voting against him, saying the war was unnecessary, and Lincoln was having the boys all killed for Negroes. He balanced his ticket with this racist dude, not knowing he'd get killed and this guy'd become the president. Sir Andrew Johnson, he acts before Congress had convened. He handpicked racist governors and they initiated black codes that were pretty much a predecessor to the Jim Crow laws. All right. That in everything but name kept the slaves on the plantations. All right. But now, with the new Congress, they called roll and they didn't call any of the Southern reps' names. They said, sorry, you don't exist. You have to start from scratch. You're a territory again. Go back. Not only do you have to ratify the 13th Amendment, which you clearly are circumventing, but also the 14th. And the 14th declared citizenship and all the rights, privileges, and protections thereof to anyone born or naturalized in any state. Okay, it's a huge amendment. So they had to approve of that one. There were two Southern states that held off, and they had to also approve of the 15th. And then the 15th, they said if it's not clear, the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship also entails suffrage, the right to politically participate in government. All right. So, in addition to that, in some of the Southern states, they initiated ironclad oaths, contending that if you had participated in the rebellion, you could not be a part of the initial government, being re-annexed as a state for a certain period of time. And the 14th Amendment kind of went with that in Article B. In Article B or Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, it stated that if you had sworn on a Bible an oath to defend the Constitution, and remember, if you did that in that capacity, you were likely a politician or an officer in the armed forces. And who that happened to hit? It happened to hit the leadership, the antebellum leadership of the White South. If you had promised to follow the Constitution, and then you thereby broke that promise by aiding the Confederate rebellion in any way, you were disfranchised. Your citizenship was taken from you for 2 years. All right. So there was some vindictiveness there. And now the antebellum elite had to sit it out for 2 years. All right. Well, in South Carolina, the African Americans had become now, they were, as citizens, the majority. And that was demonstrated in their state legislature. They had a majority of black assemblymen elected into office. Hiram Revels made it to the House of Reps. Let's see here. Blanche K. Bruce was a senator. And PBS Pinchback became a lieutenant governor. And then all the smaller level offices were occupied to some extent by African Americans, sheriffs, judges that were elected. It was like the world had turned upside down in the South momentarily between 1866 and 1868. It's known as the radical phase of Reconstruction. Then, along with the African Americans, the freedmen, right, and those who had been free prior to the war, to the African Americans, you had Southern Republicans known as scalawags, who had the audacity to be Republicans down deep in the South. And you had the infamous carpetbaggers, who were given a bad name as Northern migrants coming down into the war-torn South to supposedly enrich themselves. But a lot of these carpetbaggers, right, they demonstrated a lot of altruistic concern. A lot of them came down and they opened schools. It wasn't just the Freedmen's Bureau that established schools for black kids in the South that defended them in court. Okay, of course, the Freedmen's Bureau did all that, but so did some of these private individuals known as carpetbaggers coming down. So in the Southern press, right, this became the hated triumvirate of black men, white Republicans, white Southern Republicans, and Northern Yankee immigrants ruling the state for those 2 years. And they finally silenced the president. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was very bland. It just offered economic rights to the ex-slaves, and he vetoed it. The Freedmen's Bureau, its term ended, and they wanted to renew it. It was doing a lot of good for African Americans. He vetoed it, said that it was racist because it focused upon Black Americans and not white. Um, so they began to override his vetoes, and they set him up for impeachment. There was a loophole in the Constitution states that the president is able to handpick his cabinet members and so forth, right? With the approval of Senate. But what about firing them and replacing them? What doesn't say in the Constitution? So the radical Republicans in Congress passed a law saying that that is included in firing them. If the president removes someone, it has to be with the approval of the Senate. And it set him up perfectly. So he tried to remove some predictably kind of progressive abolitionist-like officers, and without the Senate's approval, they impeached him, and they were one single vote away from having him removed. Okay, just one vote. And he finally he got the hint, and he began to lay low. So Congress is kind of proverbially in the driver's seat now. All right. And with these new state assemblymen, new congressmen, et cetera, right? They began establishing safety net legislation. They established um, the beginnings of, well, sort of the beginnings. Horace Mann had begun it in the antebellum period, but it didn't catch on well in the South until now. But public school systems that were meant to be integrated, Black and white students together. They established penitentiaries, asylums, um, work training and employment services, orphanages, you name it. So a lot of good was done with these new Southern governments, but a lot of them spent themselves into bankruptcy. That all those things that I mentioned, they cost money. Then in addition to that, they had there were some instances of corruption. Remember the 1870s, around that time, it's called The Gilded Age by Mark Twain, right? It looked glittery and nice on the outside, but you scratch the surface and it's corroded. It was just a nice superficial gilded job at the top. So there was a lot of corruption at that time. So a lot of temptations. So for one, infrastructure. Railroad companies want to run their tracks through your town and get lots of business. Well, which one do you pick? Well, maybe one or two of them offer to bribe you. You begin developing an area and you have insider information that that's going to be developed and that property's value is going to skyrocket. And you act on that inside knowledge, either yourself or a friend or a family member, you make privy to that secret information and they profit from it. They called it graft at that time. And so there were instances of corruption, all right? People mixing their private money with public money, tax revenue, and so forth. I remember the Southerners, as libertarian tradition was so strong there, they hated to be taxed for anything. And so a contingent of Southerners, of white Southern racist Southerners, were becoming very, very resentful over this hated triumvirate's rule. And then after 2 years, right, you have the re-enfranchisement of the old elite. And they had their political traditions, they had their political skills that they'd acquired throughout the years, and they knew how to marshal that resentment well. Then you had a backlash from the KKK and the whites, the Brothers of the White Camellia, and they attacked, says Foner, 2 out of 5 African Americans that on average would go to vote at the poll. And with everything being said and done, Reconstruction lasted 12 years. And the North arguably lost interest. You have the robber barons and drama with them. You have the Indian Wars out on the plains and in the Southwest. Lots of other things were capturing the Northern public's attention in that 12-year span. So they kind of lost interest in the South as well after so many years. So at any rate, it's all going to unravel. The press is going to run on the image of Negro misrule, especially financial misrule. And the white Republicans, according to Foner, are going to kind of turn on the black Republicans and kind of throw them under the bus and promise that they themselves, if they're elected, will be more financially responsible than their black brethren. So they didn't stick together. All right. And before you know it, a lot of the white Republicans were making deals with Southern Democrats to try to stay in office. So it's going to culminate in a presidential election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and he promises to remove the troops from the South and basically leave the South alone if they choose him as president, because no one got a majority of electoral points, just simply a plurality. And when no one gets a majority, the top two are decided upon by the House. And it seems like every time that's happened, some kind of a deal has been cut in the House. That's kind of fishy. So at any rate, it's not going to last. Reconstruction is not going to last. That's why later on, you have people call the civil rights movement 100 years later the second Reconstruction, right? The second and finally the somewhat successful attempt at reconstructing the South. All right. But again, going back to it, I'm making the argument that they didn't have the staying power largely because their motives weren't pure to begin with. They were more in a punitive mood, if you will, of putting the South in its place. And they didn't have a lot of like genuine zeal that you found in the abolitionist, like really insisting on justice for the African Americans. All right. So, and by the way, you had over 300 assemblymen and 16 congressmen that were African Americans. The one second to the left is Blanche K. Bruce, and he's known as the father of Black education in Mississippi. Francis Cardoso was known for his mathematical genius and his integrity. Robert Smalls on the far right was for remuneration for ex-slaves in the form of, as with Field Order number 15 and the Freedmen's Bureau attempt to give 40 acres and a mule to every ex-slave family. And of course, that never happened. Right. Then one number two, very simple thesis, is that political solutions superficially do not work with social problems. All right. You can pass a law that ends slavery. And we saw the way the South for a year or two got around that with the black codes. You can enfranchise them, right, with the 14th and 15th Amendment and let them participate in politics. But it was always contested, always resented, and almost fated not to last. All right. But getting people not to use the N-word, getting people to no longer have the prejudice of the Sambo image of black men, happy-go-lucky, lacking self-control, ignorant, dangerous, criminally prone, violent, kind of a nature, kind of a creature of impulse. That's a whole other story, right? That's a much deeper root to pull out than simply giving them, getting them off the plantations and giving them certain rights. And I'm saying that wasn't addressed sufficiently in the South. And I point to a few institutions and demographics that I think kind of dropped the ball in affecting cultural, social change. For one, right, an obvious one is they should have been more strict with the public school system. There was white flight and the opening of private schools and so forth. And so that the white South just would not send their kids with black kids to school. And, going back to Aristotle, he says habituation, right? Your daily habits, rubbing elbows with people from day to day. That's what helps put an end to prejudice and racism. And that just didn't happen with the kids in school. All right. So the educational institutions kind of dropped the ball. And the blacks have to admit, right, that they did run with black only colleges and freedmen's schools. There was a sense of distrust, and rightfully so. And so they were fine with having schools with just black kids. So integration, there just weren't a whole lot of wholehearted effort employed into that crusade. Another one, of course, are the churches, Catholic or evangelical. They you had a second great awakening, largely in the North. You had the breaking of the Methodists and the Baptists over the issue of slavery. And you had some northern denominations show a genuine interest in using biblical support to put an end not only to slavery, but to prejudice and to racial discrimination. As you may recall, when we did the write-up on slavery and Christianity given to the slaves and the myriad of different results that ensued from that, one was a sense of either a camaraderie, and if maybe not that far, at least enhanced self-esteem on behalf of the black slaves from parts of the Bible that I mentioned in that slavery handout. Remember, one of them was from the book of Acts in the Bible, where Peter thought that Christianity and the gospel were just for the Jews. And he said that God told him that anyone from all nations is open to God's love as long as they fear and come draw near to him from every nation on earth. You have cosmopolitan verses like that. Of course, the assertion in the book of Genesis that all mankind was made in the image of God. Those have ramifications, if you believe that you could run with and be cosmopolitan, right? Like a citizen of the whole world and tolerant, and also be egalitarian, where everyone's on equal footing, made in the image of God. So I feel like the church has kind of dropped the ball as well, and not effecting cultural change. All right. And then the intelligentsia. Remember Abraham Lincoln when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? He clasped her hands with both of his, and he said, "So you're the little lady who started this war." And that might have been hyperbole, strategic exaggeration, but it still made a point, right? That these romantic, sentimental novels, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, made quite an impression on the entire country. And so the intelligentsia, the writers, they dropped the ball as well, in my humble estimation, as far as trying to effect cultural change, toleration, okay, egalitarianism, again, everyone on equal footing. They kind of dropped the ball as well. So you have the school system, you have the churches, you have the intelligentsia that I'm contending could have made some inroads in changing the culture, but they didn't. And then also political and military leaders from the get-go during the war. If you look up Benjamin Butler, especially, you have these gentlemen in the North who would free the slaves when they would win in certain areas, but then they would demonstrate plenty of evidence of of prejudice uh, once they freed them. They wrote about them being a nuisance, having to babysit them, having to feed them. They wrote disparagingly of them, of their character, and of their alleged ignorance. And so it kind of lends itself to the Dunning thesis that they were partly freeing these slaves out of vindictiveness toward the white South to take away their property as, quote, contraband. Grant, you can make the argument when you read his biography that he kind of slowly came around, but initially, for sure, he showed an indifference and kind of almost disdain at first. All right. So they kind of dropped the ball as well. And then we've gone over with revisionist history of the Civil War, how racism was alive and well in the North as it was in the South. As you may recall, 19 northern states and only 5 offered some citizenship rights to some black men. 5 out of 19. The draft riots, they attacked black people. For quite some time, African American soldiers were paid $3 less a month. They weren't trusted to fight for quite some time. They didn't trust their loyalty and discipline. And so adherence to the old Sambo image was in the North as well, through minstrel shows and other means. So at any rate, that's what I'm contending here, is that you can't solve a social problem with mere political laws, that they needed to bring about a cultural change in the South and certain demographics, like Northern politicians, Northern military leaders, evangelical and Catholic leaders, the intelligentsia, the school systems. They dropped the ball, in my humble estimation. They dropped the ball. They didn't address the cultural adherence to the same old paradigm of the black people almost deserving to be enslaved because they can't handle autonomy and freedom on their own, being lacking in self-control, being naturally dangerous, being ignorant, being kind of creatures of instinct rather than rational beings. That wasn't sufficiently challenged. So that's number 2. All right. Is anyone on here? Anyone have any questions or comments? All right. So if no one's here, I will post this and good luck. We're almost finished. Okay. Hang in there and you guys take care.